Hello, Stephen here. We've got a great episode for you today, but before it begins, I want to just take a quick moment to encourage you to vote in the upcoming election if you are a United States citizen. Depending on when you're listening, there may even still be time to register to vote in your state. So you can check your registration status and register to vote by visiting www.vote.org. However you vote, whether it be by mail or in person, please make a plan to vote. And if you can, vote early. Thanks. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Future Cities. I'm your host, Stephen Elser. This month, we're bringing you an episode about pedestrian safety. This is a topic that many of us have probably been thinking about for quite some time. I know when I was a kid, my parents ingrained in me the need to look both ways before crossing any street so as to not be hit by an oncoming car. And if you live in a city, you've no doubt observed or experienced firsthand the danger that cars pose to pedestrians. And since 2009, the number of pedestrian deaths in the US has increased by 50%, with over 6,000 pedestrians dying in 2018. And these deaths are not spread out evenly across the population. Those most vulnerable to this traffic violence are people of color, poor communities, the elderly, and other marginalized groups. So, why the increase in pedestrian deaths? Why do the patterns of a typical victim exist? Who is to blame, and what can be done to address these issues? Our guest this month is Angie Schmitt. She's an author and expert on the topic of pedestrian safety and has recently written a book covering these topics. So, without further ado, here's our conversation.
Yeah, my name is Angie Schmitt. I'm the author of a new book called Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. It was published last month by Island Press. For about 9 years, I worked at Streetsblog, which is a news site. We called it advocacy journalism that was trying to follow the movement for better walking, biking, and transit in cities. So at the end of that, I was the national editor. So in 9 years of reporting, I just accumulated a lot of knowledge about these issues. And at one point, I had like a young baby, like a 1-year-old, but I was just spending a lot of time in the evenings on social media. So I thought, I should take what I've learned and put it in a book. And I think that this issue had been sort of overlooked. And I just think it's a real injustice what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So could you actually then tell us, how much of a problem is traffic violence in the United States?
So the United States is a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the wealthy world or westernized democracies. We have, just for comparison, about twice as many people on a per capita basis are killed here in car wrecks as compared to Canada. And if we could do as well as some of the best performers in Western Europe, we could save about 30,000 lives a year. Now that's total traffic deaths, not just pedestrian deaths.
Wow, that's pretty incredible, especially the comparison you made to Canada, a country that a lot of us sort of compare ourselves to Canada because they're not that far away from us culturally. They are sort of similar to us. So it's amazing that there is such a stark difference between the two of us.
Yeah, it is.
So we've already used this phrase a couple of times. You use it in your book. It's in the keywords of your book, traffic violence. So could you just explain the significance of that phrase and why you use it over other phrases like car accident?
Right. I actually didn't use that word a ton in my book, but it is preferred by a lot of activists. And there's a lot of problems with using the term accident to describe these very oftentimes gruesome incidents that are occurring all over America every day, right? It sort of sanitizes the issue, and it creates the notion that no one is at fault, when oftentimes these crashes are very predictable. And there may be a lot of culpability, not just in the person driving, but also in the people engineering the environments in which they take place. So, certain activists prefer the term traffic violence, and they think it's a better descriptor, and it doesn't create the impression that nothing can be done, that these incidents are just acts of God. And that's something that in traffic safety, they've always sort of, in the United States, struggled against that notion, that framing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to sort of point out that, it's not totally out of control, out of anyone's control. There are things that we can do to avoid these incidents from occurring. It's not just, as you said, an act of God. So I think the phrases that we use are really important in framing. In the first chapter of your book, you outline some of the patterns associated with traffic violence and pedestrian deaths. So can you describe some of these patterns and like what sorts of people tend to be victims, where and when do these incidents occur?
Yeah, so in almost every city, there's just a handful of streets that account for a hugely disproportionate share of these kind of crashes, injury crashes or fatal crashes. Like one example I use in the book is there's a single road in Rockford, Illinois, that almost a quarter of all injury crashes occur on a single road. And there was a similar sort of road in Philadelphia, Roosevelt Boulevard. So in Roosevelt Boulevard is, it would be really obvious if you visited it why. It's 12 lanes wide. The speeds are very high, and that's sort of typical of where we see big problem streets. We call these suburban arterials, and so not only are they high speed and very wide often, they also, a key feature is that they will have a lot of retail a lot of times, or a mix of retail and housing. So there's a lot of destinations that people are trying to access, and some of them are trying to access them on foot. And then there's sort of a demographic profile of who's likely to be killed in a pedestrian death as well that I spend a lot of time talking about in the book. And it's really sad, but it's sort of marginalized folks from a bunch of different marginalized identities, right? And a lot of times they're intersecting or overlapping. So people of color, Black and Latino folks, Native folks are all at increased risks, especially Native people. There's some evidence that people with disabilities are at increased risk, wheelchair users in particular. Older folks are another group that's at high risk. For sort of obvious reasons. And then also another group is men. Men are much more likely to be struck and killed while walking than women.
So there are a couple of things that I actually want to touch on there. One, I just want to react to this point that you made here and in the book, the 12 lanes of traffic on Roosevelt Boulevard in Philadelphia. That's like incredible, having that many lanes of traffic. Like, and that's not even a highway, correct? That's just
right.
Arterial.
Right. It sort of functions like a highway, right? But it is at grade, and it's not limited access. Pedestrians can use it. So yeah, those kind of roads are really, really deadly. And some of those are like service access roads, but it's still all adjacent. It's like a football. It's like the length of a football field to cross it.
Yeah, that's just unbelievable. So I live in the Phoenix area, and Phoenix popped up several times in your book. And as a layperson to this topic, I've thought that Phoenix is probably not a very pedestrian friendly city because it's so frequently you have like these 5 or 6 lane roads, across, where people want to be crossing. So I live half a mile from Arizona State's Tempe campus. And just outside my apartment complex, there is a 5-lane road with 45-mile-per-hour speed limits. I've almost been hit multiple times. Friends of mine have been hit on this road, and it's like so close to a campus, and yet we have this much, high velocity traffic. It's sort of wild to think about.
Yeah, it's sort of Phoenix. I pick on Phoenix a lot in the book. It's sort of a nightmare, yeah. And it's like that's inexcusable. I'm sorry, but campuses need special attention. And that's just inexcusable to have a really dangerous situation going right through. Although, I mean, we see it all too frequently.
Yeah, Phoenix, as we've talked, did come up several times, and it's just like, as someone who actually grew up here, it's like, I really just wish someday, the Phoenix metro area would like be in the news or in a book for like something positive. But like, it's like always bad things that Phoenix and like Arizona tend to be sort of talked about, which is unfortunate.
Oh,
Hopefully,
really?
we'll.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
someone from Ohio, I don't think of Phoenix. Well, maybe, obviously Phoenix has a lot going for it economically and everything. But this is just definitely one area where Phoenix, and it's not alone among Rust Belt cities, or I'm sorry, among Sun Belt cities. Almost all the Sun Belt cities are really dangerous places for walkers.
So in 2018, more than 6,000 people, pedestrians, were killed. And so why you talk about this in your book, but could you explain to us here why do you think there's such a lack of urgency for addressing all of these pedestrian deaths?
So, yeah, that's a good question. One reason I think it's happening is because, again, how we talked about, a lot of the victims are disproportionately marginalized type type folks. So, I think like it's not people like most of the people being killed or put in dangerous situations or injured aren't people with a ton of influence in our systems of government and in the media, et cetera, right? So they're not very powerful people. And I think that's one of the reasons why we look past it. And a lot of times we, instead of being sympathetic to the victims, just blame them, right? And often it's kind of surprisingly cruel, the way we respond and the language we use.
Yeah, I guess could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean when we sometimes blame the victims of traffic violence?
Right. So there's sort of like a script usually in the newspaper when there might be like a couple paragraphs every time someone is killed. And then usually the police report and then the reporter who's working off the police report will subtly blame the victim. Well, they'll include like statements like wasn't in a crosswalk or wasn't wearing bright clothing. And a lot of times that's like, it can be factually inaccurate because a lot of reporters and police don't understand that technically every intersection is an unmarked crosswalk. But also sometimes it's way more blatant, like down at one of the guys I picked on in the book is the head of your highway safety in Arizona. I think his name is Alberto Gutierrez. He's in charge of highway safety in Arizona, which was recently, according to one ranking, the most dangerous state in the country for pedestrians. And he did an interview with the New Times in Phoenix where he just entirely blames pedestrians. And he even joked about it. Like he held up this sign that said, use the crosswalk, stupid. So he calling dead people who were killed, sort of on his watch, on his agency's watch, stupid. I think that that's really appalling. And I think like culturally we've not had sort of a come to Jesus moment about this, because I don't think we would talk about a lot of other major killers, people who were killed by other major killers this way. Like even in some of the types of deaths that are more stigmatized, like suicide or opioid deaths. I can't imagine, someone from public health calling opioid users that were killed stupid or immoral the way he did in that case.
Yeah, that's just extremely cruel, as you said. Okay, so we sort of alluded to, well, you were talking about the Sun Belt earlier, and I think this will probably relate to this question. So you present in your book a rule of thumb about pedestrian safety, that if a city or state was developed after the invention of air conditioning, that it's likely to be a dangerous place to walk when compared to locations that were developed before the invention of air conditioning. So could you describe how design principles have changed over time to create such a distinction?
Yeah. So another way you could put it is prior to 1940 and after 1940. There's a guy who did a pretty interesting study, and he says prior to 1940 in the United States, it was before cars really became the primary mode of transportation in the United States. We had cities that were based a lot more on walking or streetcars. So the street pattern tends to be a grid, right? And a grid is ideal for pedestrians. There's a lot of different choices about which way to go. It shortens the distances between locations. And there is a lot of research that shows places that have more grid-like street patterns, more people walk, okay? But then after 1940, post 1940, and that's coming to the era where air conditioning starts to come online and people are migrating to warmer climates, like places in Florida that prior to that weren't super inhabitable or super comfortable for folks. So after that era, we enter sort of the highway era in the United States, where the big agenda of civil engineering was building the interstate highway system. And the street pattern that prevailed in that era is the suburban pattern, which is sort of like when you think of a suburban development that has cul-de-sacs, big winding roads that sort of dead ends, and then they all feed onto those suburban arterials that we talked about that are so dangerous. So the good news is the study that I mentioned in the book and that I'm referencing now shows there has been a change in the last 10 years, but those areas, cities like Phoenix that developed almost exclusively after the rise, or in a modern way, after the rise of air conditioning, have a built environment that is really hostile to pedestrians.
It's sort of funny seeing how well, the changes in design influence this, but also influence sorts of things that I think about. So, like 100 years ago, Phoenix looked totally different, which is just not unsurprising. And there were trees everywhere. The roads were really narrow, so the trees could actually like totally provide shade over the streets, and there weren't those big arterial roads as you're talking about. And that's created like these unfortunate circumstances of like making our cities hotter and less walkable in that way, and it also sort of coincides with also making them more dangerous just in terms of having more exposure to traffic violence and cars and whatnot. So just sort of interesting to see how these design principles manifest themselves in different ways and affect sort of different aspects of our lives.
Yeah, you have all these parking lots and these wide roads creating heat islands.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a guy named David King in Arizona that looked at how much of Phoenix was parking lots, and it was just kind of appalling.
Yeah, it really is. And there's like strip malls everywhere, and each of them has giant parking lots associated with them. It's just asphalt everywhere, and it's unfortunate because it doesn't have to be that way. We could do better things with our city and make it more pedestrian friendly, biker and all of that. But okay, so as you point out in the book, and as we've already discussed, communities of color and low-income communities tend to have higher rates of pedestrian deaths, and they've also frequently been overlooked when municipalities are deploying infrastructure resources that might alleviate those issues. And so when you overlay data about race and socioeconomic status with data about traffic incidents, those communities light up. So can you elaborate on some of the reasons behind these trends and what role that systemic racism plays?
Yeah, there's a really smart guy that wrote the foreword for my book named Charles Brown, and he's a researcher and adjunct professor at Rutgers. And what he says is when white communities, when they complain about safety problems, they get infrastructure treatments. But neighborhoods of color, when they complain, they get enforcement, right? So they get police coming out to their neighborhoods and ticketing them. And sometimes that really devolves into ugly situations. So one of the cases I looked at really closely in my book is Portland. And like Portland has a reputation for being really bike friendly, and I think it's deserved, and they're doing a lot of good things. But if you look at Portland, there's really stark disparities between the wider, wealthier parts of the city and the poorer, more diverse parts of the city. And in Portland, that's called East Portland. And people in people who live in East Portland only make up 25% of the population, but they have 50% of the traffic fatalities. And the city recently mapped its 30 most dangerous intersections, and 28 out of 30 were in East Portland.
So yeah, when I was reading some of this, as I said, a lot of it wasn't necessarily surprising because of some other trends that I already know about in cities from my own research. And so this, and with respect to traffic deaths, the same sort of patterns emerge with respect to tree cover and other forms of green infrastructure, where
Right.
communities of color and low-income communities tend to have fewer trees and less green infrastructure. And in Phoenix, I keep talking about Phoenix, but this results in higher temperatures and more exposure to extreme heat. And that's a big killer here. And in 2018, 182 people in Maricopa County, the county where Phoenix is located, died from heat-related ailments. And the victims of that heat also tend to fit a similar profile that you described already. And part of the reason, as you point out in your book, is that Black, Hispanic, and Native American people tend to walk more frequently than non-Hispanic white people. So these people are more exposed to traffic violence, in addition to being more exposed to heat as they walk to work, as they walk to the store, as they walk to the bus station, since their communities tend to have less cooling infrastructure features. So these communities are just constantly sort of barraged with different sorts of
Yeah, there's very serious inequality issues in cities. Very serious. I mean, that's part of the reason we've seen these protest movements explode recently, of course.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Violence, but also the underlying inequality.
So moving forward, you dedicate one chapter of your book to the role of technology in pedestrian safety, with a lot of attention paid to autonomous vehicles. And you highlight the story from 2 years ago when a homeless woman, Elaine Herzberg, was killed by a self-driving Uber car in Tempe, Arizona, just like a couple miles from where I live. So first, could you briefly describe that event, and then tell us about the actions and inactions of Uber and local officials that allowed for it to happen?
I'm sorry, where to start? Where to start with this? So it's really, everyone who looked into this really closely, and it got a lot of attention, a lot more attention than a regular pedestrian death, was really sort of infuriated by it because basically Uber was testing these cars, self-driving cars in Arizona. A number of other companies were as well. And there was a woman was killed, right? Like you mentioned, a homeless woman. She was trying to cross the street. It was a very wide, a very dangerous street for pedestrians. It meets all the characteristics we've talked about. So that was probably part of the problem. But also, there was a ton of warning that this might occur. Just like a couple weeks before she was killed, it may have been the week before, there was a whistleblower within Uber that wrote to the chief executives and said, our cars are hitting things every 1,400 miles, or 14,000, I believe it was. That a lot of the backup drivers were not properly vetted or trained. And that was really prophetic. There was a backup driver in the car that hit Elaine Herzberg, but she was watching The Voice on her phone. She was watching Hulu at the time of the crash. But I think that the news just came out that she's going to be charged criminally, which I think is an outrage for a few reasons. And one of them is, so NTSB looked into this case really closely. They're a federal agency that does, a lot of times they're looking into plane crashes and that kind of thing. So they investigated this, and there's a ton of data about this. And what it showed was that the tech they're using in this Uber, it was an SUV, detected Elaine Herzberg in the road 6 seconds before she was hit, okay? But the car did not brake at all. And it did not even issue a warning to the backup driver that she was in the road ahead. And it turns out that the reason that they did that is Uber had deactivated emergency braking in these vehicles. And the reason they deactivated emergency braking is because they wanted to go to market with self-driving cars. They wanted to replace their, they use human drivers when you get an Uber, and that's expensive for the company, and they've always lost a lot of money. Uber has lost billions of dollars, and it's never been profitable since it was founded more than a decade ago. So they really, there was a lot of financial incentive for them to do away with human drivers. And they were really reckless, I think, in this case, in trying to reach that goal. So they had, the reason they programmed the car not to brake is because, according to some reporting, if you ride in a car that brakes a lot, right? So if every time the computer is detecting something in the road ahead, there's a lot of like false positives, right? If like a plastic black bag blows across the road and the car brakes and the car is constantly braking, it makes people nauseous. So Uber was in this race to sort of get this technology to market. And so it was being reckless. In my opinion, it was being really reckless. And this woman, Elaine Herzberg, was killed. And now this backup driver, who is one of the type of folks we were talking about, who's a little bit marginalized in a lot of ways, now faces very serious criminal charges.
Yeah, that certainly seems like Uber should be facing a lot more of the backlash of that, and not the woman who is sitting behind the wheel of the car. Um, I you also spent some time talking in the book that I thought was really a great point is that Uber and Governor Ducey basically okayed the Phoenix area to be just the trial run for these vehicles without really the consent of all of the people that are living here. So could you talk a little bit more about that sort of ethical side of things?
Yeah, it's kind of scary. I think like for the incentives for governors, a lot of states, I put 12 at the last I checked when I wrote in the book, about 12 states were allowing this. And I think for governors, it seems like sort of a slam dunk. They don't really have to spend any money. They just have to okay it. But there's a lot of, but basically they're allowing these companies to beta test this potentially deadly product on their residents. And we don't allow this in other sectors. Like a pharmaceutical industry could not test a potentially fatal drug on you without your explicit consent. We have very careful controls in place for that. So there was a lot of and there is some evidence that Arizona residents did not consent to this. They didn't have any way to directly weigh in except for electing the governor. But there's a really good New York Times article from a few years back that talks about how there was a number of incidents where Arizona residents were attacking these vehicles with sticks and rocks. There's a lot of outrage about what was taking place. And one thing I want to mention, just to really quickly tack on, is it's important to know that nobody is regulating these companies. The federal government has passed zero regulations to date, even though there's been all this testing about how the company should operate. There's really no safety protocols. They did issue some voluntary guidelines, and the companies do participate in some voluntary reporting. But there was no way, either in the state of Arizona, which had no regulations related to this, or the federal government, nobody was tracking Uber. If they had been, they might have been able to tell, hey, Uber's AV performance is concerning. Maybe we need to pull these cars off the road for the protection of the public. But there is no kind of safeguard like that in place.
Yeah, it really seems like laws are just not keeping pace with how fast technology is moving with respect to autonomous vehicles.
It's not that they can't. It's not that they can't keep up either. It's about a little bit about power and who has power. It's not. It's not like your average Joe in Arizona. It's billion-dollar corporations, right? They're
Right.
more powerful politically, and right now we have a very anti-regulation administration in Washington as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me a good just reminder for people to vote. This will be coming out in October, so please vote in the upcoming election. Um, so with all that said about autonomous vehicles and this terrible incident in Tempe regarding Uber, do you have any hope that autonomous vehicles can be part of a solution to traffic violence?
Yes, I do. I do. But I don't think a lot of people that know more than me don't think that we're going to see autonomous vehicles anytime soon or ever. A lot of people. That's not really what I'm looking forward to, but there are some technologies that make cars partially automated that are already coming online and in some cases standard in a lot of new vehicles. And I am sort of excited about the impact that kind of stuff could have. And that's things like automatic emergency braking, pedestrian detection. There's a whole range of different technologies, and in some cases the effects on this issue are unclear. But there's one study that I cited in the book that shows Subaru cars that have a package of some of these technologies have 35% fewer pedestrian crash claims on their insurance, for example.
Wow, that's great. I mean, that seems like it's that. I mean, 35%. That's a huge chunk of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge thing.
I
Okay.
think that they're like an industry leader, maybe a little bit. So that, but yeah, yeah, if we could install that kind of technology in every car, yeah, it could make a huge difference. And I think like one of the problems is, again, we have this anti-regulation sort of administration in Washington, but the federal government has been really shy, really hesitant to impose any regulations on automakers specifically for the protection of pedestrians. Like we have all these auto regulations, things like seatbelts and things like airbags and anti-lock brakes, then those are all things for the most part that protect the driver and the passengers in the car. But there's like sort of this whole frontier in auto safety that we have never really tackled in the United States about pedestrian safety. And all that stuff would also protect cyclists. But one thing that's kind of disappointing is, we're having this crisis right now where pedestrian deaths have increased 50% in a decade, and there's no reason to think that's going to change on its own. And we have a new class of vehicles I talk about a lot in the book, huge pickup trucks. Pickup trucks have gotten much bigger, and SUVs. We've seen this huge rise in SUVs, and there's no move to require even the most dangerous vehicles to require some of this stuff like pedestrian detection.
Yeah, so it's probably obvious to a lot of our listeners why pickup trucks and SUVs might be more dangerous to pedestrians, but could you just briefly touch on that for us?
Yeah, I write about this a lot in the book. So there's been a big shift, and one of the main reasons we've seen this big increase in pedestrian deaths in the United States is there's been a big shift in the auto market and what Americans are buying and what they're driving. Since about 2012, we've seen a shift where almost 75% of the vehicles being purchased were sedans, right? Regular cars. And now it's almost the complete opposite, where 75% of the vehicles being purchased are SUVs or pickups. And a lot of those are crossover SUVs. And there's really, really strong evidence that SUVs are more dangerous for pedestrians. According to some research from the Federal Highway Administration, they are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill pedestrians. And for child pedestrians, they're 4 times more likely to kill them if they're struck.
Yeah, thank you. So why do you think there is such a shift occurring in the types of cars that Americans are driving?
So it's sort of totally like a fashion thing. Like nobody's really driving off road, right? Very few people have access to the kind of lands where they would really drive off road. So there's really no need for off road vehicles for the average person. And SUVs actually have some drawbacks safety wise. Even today, they're not as dangerous as they were a decade and a half ago, but they're still twice as likely to roll over in a crash as a sedan. Like I said, it's sort of a fashion thing. And I think that the auto industry is driving it a lot, although consumers definitely clearly have an appetite for this as well. But the auto industry makes a ton of money selling SUVs and big pickup trucks. Like somebody told me Chevy makes $17,000 on in profit on every Silverado they sell. That's compared to like sometimes they only make $1,500 on like a compact car on the low end, and they're able to sell crossover SUVs for $10,000 to $15,000 more than the car bodies they're based on, and they don't cost very much more to make. So they're profiting. They're making a ton of money selling SUVs, and they do a lot to market them. Like if you watch television, I can barely watch television anymore. It's so triggering for me, but it's all like pushing these big SUVs and pickups.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really considered the marketing side of things with that. Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. Great. So I want to move on to maybe some maybe positive aspects, I guess, of this or moving forward. So like what are some ways that we as like individual citizens can act to promote pedestrian safety in our communities?
Yeah, so one thing I'd encourage people to do if they don't do this already is just try taking a walk around where they live, and not just like and maybe a walk that has a useful purpose, maybe a walk to a retail place, or maybe a walk to the bus stop, maybe take a bus ride, just to see what that's like if that's not part of your routine. And advocating for this stuff, you might be able to get plugged in with there's advocacy groups in a lot of cities that are working on this, and they a lot of times they're really underfunded and they really need all the help they can get. But a lot of this stuff is just like good civics 101, calling your city council person, or emailing them, or speaking at a city council meeting, or writing a letter, that kind of thing.
So you mentioned in the book that, there's several U.S. cities that have made a commitment to end traffic deaths altogether. So could you describe what these cities are actually doing to achieve that goal?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about whether they're doing enough, but one of the things they do a lot of times is they map where the crashes are occurring, and then they try to do some design changes to the most dangerous roads and the most dangerous intersections. One of the more successful examples is New York City, and one of the most effective things they've done there is actually a pretty inexpensive intervention. They're just retiming a lot of traffic lights, and they are adding a thing called a leading pedestrian interval, and that just means that the pedestrian gets the walk signal a few seconds before turning cars get that green light. And that way, pedestrians are in the middle of the crosswalk when the light changes, and that makes them more visible. And that combined with this other thing they do called intersection hardening, which is a little hard to explain, but again, is an inexpensive sort of treatment, help produce like a 45% decline in pedestrian deaths in New York City.
Yeah, those solutions totally make sense, although maybe not initially intuitive. Yeah, like what you said about the just the timing of the lights. It's such a simple thing, but it's probably not something that a lot of people are really necessarily thinking about as they, walk around themselves. So as I was reading your book, I started to see some connections between some of the pedestrian safety solutions that you describe and some of the solutions that are frequently discussed in our research network with respect to extreme weather events brought on by climate change. So in chapter 6, you mentioned that transport planners might consider planting trees near a road to make it appear more narrow and to provide a visual cue to drivers to slow down. And trees are also a popular nature-based solution to various climate change issues. They mitigate heat, they store carbon, they can also mitigate flood to some degree. And also during our scenario workshops that our network puts on, participants frequently set goals for the year 2080 to have totally carless neighborhoods and sectors in their city, which obviously would increase pedestrian safety in those areas. And, they make these goals in the context of trying to make their cities more resilient to extreme weather events in, future climate change scenarios. So I'm wondering how, if at all, you see your advocacy for pedestrian safety aligning with issues of climate change mitigation and adaptation.
It's actually not something I've been really focused on, like, not extreme weather events at all, really. And I'm in a part of the country that's a little bit not super affected, so that might be part of the reason. But obviously, it's not great for the climate for people not to be able to make practical, safe walking trips in their communities. And we've really gotten to a point in the United States where I think the vast majority of people can't walk safely around their homes. And it's become a little bit, walking has become a little bit of like a luxury good, as we've had a little bit of a gentrification, and some some wealthier communities have embraced this more than the ideas about ideals of walking, more than some lower income communities. So to the extent that it feeds into this really energy intensive transportation system we have, where people don't even have the option to walk if they want to, or they, you know, at least they have concerns about that. It does contribute, I think.
Okay, so we're reaching near the end of our time, and I've asked you to write a haiku about some aspect of your book. So would you mind sharing that with the listeners?
Yeah, yeah. I have to
Thank
say,
you.
I tried to write a haiku, and this is not really my thing, and I think it sounds a little more like I tried to write a limerick. Like I'm getting my poetry genres mixed up, but okay. Here was my attempt at this. Uh, this is my serious haiku voice, okay? I'm trying
Okay,
to
I'm
do
ready.
that too. Okay, it goes like this. When trying to cross, here comes Ford pickup. Too bad, weren't in a crosswalk.
That's great. You're right. It does sort of have a limerick sort of flow to it.
I
That's
don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe I'm part Irish.
great. Excellent. Thank you so much for doing that. Okay, those are all the questions that I had for you. So I guess before we leave, do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with? And then also, where can they get your book?
Yeah. One thing I'm really hoping people will take away from it is just to sort of think through and question. And I'm sure if anyone who listened this far, question how do we respond to this, right? And we need to be thinking about, the rights of people to walk, and not just thinking of people who are trying to get somewhere in a different way than us as interfering with our ability to move, right? And the book, so you can get it through the publisher at Island Press. And if you use my last name is Schmidt, Schmitt, as that's good for a 20% discount through the publisher. So again, that's Island Press. Or it should be available at bookstores in a lot of cities. And if not, through their website. A lot of times you can order it through your favorite bookstore. Um, and that's good. I won't pitch Amazon. I'll skip pitching Amazon. I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah, I mean they don't need help anyway, so they don't need.
Right, right.
All right. Well, fantastic, Angie. It was so great to meet with you and talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, that's our show for the month. Thanks so much for listening, and again, please, please, please vote in this upcoming election. Obviously, the national races are extremely important, but the local elections are crucial too, especially for tackling these issues of pedestrian safety that we discussed today. Those city council members, mayors, and state legislators that are on your ballot will be making decisions that affect your right to safely walk in your community. Vote. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks again for listening. The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at futurecitiespod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.